Donc, j'ai maintenant le plaisir d'accueillir Dan Wicklum, qui sera notre modérateur pour cette dernière table ronde sur le plafonnement des émissions de gaz et de pétrole.
I'm going to sit here, and you guys can sit here. And Sarah's going to be on the screen. Thank you very much. My name is Dan Wicklum. I think I'm a reasonable choice, actually, to moderate this panel, because for 7 years, what I did was launch and then operate the original oil sands collaborative, where the CEOs got together very regularly and decided to collaborate to try to improve their environmental performance. So I co-chaired a CEO panel that met extremely regularly. And that organization actually evolved into the Pathways Alliance, where we have a representative from, which is Mark Cameron, one of our panelists. And then we have Chris Severinsen-Baker, who is the executive director of the PEMINent Institute, which probably needs no introduction to people. And then on the screen, we have Sarah Hastings-Simon, who's a professor from the University of Calgary. So this is the oil and gas panel. This is the way it's going to run. I'm actually going to spend a very short amount of time setting some context with 4 slides that the Climate Institute put together. I would say all the panelists have been exposed to the slides, and they have de facto vetted them and say that that is appropriate slides to use to set the context. Then we're going to ask some canned questions. I'll tell you, the panel got together, and they know the questions, but we purposely didn't discuss them. I think we're all tired, especially me, of canned conversations and canned answers. So this is sort of de facto raw interaction here. This is really what this type of event, I think, is about, and we need more of that. And then, of course, we're going to go to the audience. So please put your questions into Slido. We can see them on the monitor here, and we will answer some of your questions as well. So on the screen here, you can see 2 slides. The take-home message is, on the left-hand figure here that the Climate Institute put together, is basically the amount of emissions, absolute emissions, by sector, as they appear in Canada's emissions reduction plan. So this is the latest data that we have. Should not be new to anyone in the room. So the oil and gas is sort of the largest, at about 28%. Transportation, buildings, heavy industry, agriculture, electricity. Really want this panel to actually be balanced and not bashing a sector or bashing a company. So I'm just going to point out that when you have that type of economic activity in this country, it's really, really important. If the oil and gas sector was to go away tomorrow, we would have a huge economic hole to dig out of in this country. There would be remarkable cascading effects into our tax bases and our service. That's just the reality. So let's try to take a balanced approach to this. But having said that, the oil and gas sector is the largest emitting sector. And then on the right-hand side here is basically the change. It's the delta of each of those sectors over the last number of years, 2005, which is the base year for our national targets, and 2022. So we have basically a reduction of the total. Everyone knows the electricity sector is driving improvements. But then there's heavy industry, which has, think cement, think steel, think fertilizer. And then we keep going to the left, transportation, agriculture, buildings, and then oil and gas. Now, the reality is this shows that oil and gas is increasing, and it has increased the most across sectors between 2005 and 2022. But there's a deeper story to that in terms of the emissions intensity, and I'll come to that in just a moment here. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is a slide that the Climate Institute put together as well. And essentially what this shows is the projection of emissions in the sector based on no emissions cap. So without a cap on oil and gas emissions, the notion is, by the Climate Institute's modeling, is the sector falls short of its 2030 targets, and then with a cap. And let's be serious, the elephant in the room is the government of Canada has messaged quite strongly that it was going to come out with a cap to regulate the amount of emissions coming out of the oil and gas sector writ large, and that is the subject of remarkable political and debate among regions and among companies and among governments at this point. But the point is that based solely on existing measures versus implementing the announced cap, that is about the 2 trajectories based on the company's own projections about what emissions will be like. Fair enough. Understanding this is modeled data. Okay, let's keep going here. There we go. Okay, what this is the emissions intensities of products from about 2005 to, again, to 2022. One of the things I'll point out is that we tend to think of the oil and gas sector as this big monolith, but we call it the oil and gas sector. The reality is there's a remarkable number of products inside of that, different types of gas, different types of oil. And there's remarkable diversity and heterogeneity in terms of the types of companies. Tiny little ones, huge ones, just domestic ones, international ones. So it's very useful to pull them apart and understand what the performance is based on different metrics, like, in this case, different types of actual fossil fuels. So here's an oil one, and we're unpacking this. This is the total production. This is the total absolute emissions going up. And interesting, you can see the jumps up and down, for sure. This is the oil sands intensity. And it's actually tracked steadily downwards from 2005 to 2022. I've got some experience in this, and the reality is the companies are extremely motivated to become more and more and more efficient. One of the great cost inputs into oil sands is heating water into steam so they can melt the oil away from the sand. That's a huge energy input, so it's a huge cost. And it's a huge energy input, so that's where most of the emissions come from when you actually make a barrel of oil sands. So the companies are extremely motivated to use less and less energy inputs because they save money. And the reality is over the whole course of the oil sands, like literally since its conception, they have increased their productivity by, on average, 1% to 2%. And because of that, decreased their emissions by about 1% to 2% every year. They're extremely motivated to do that, and frankly, they're really good at it. So this is the explanation, really, for this decrease in emissions is because they have motivated to increase their productivity, and with that, they get emissions reductions. Fair enough. Where are we here? This is the natural gas, the intensity of our natural gas. This is a great positive story for Canada. We have about the cleanest natural gas in the world, and we're actually probably going to get better with some of the regulatory mechanisms that are going to come in. And this is the emissions intensity with conventional oil. So this is basically every type of oil that is not oil sands. It's a normal or conventional oil. Fair enough. Last slide. Okay, this is sort of a standard graph that people show to sort of say, where does Canada's emissions intensity stack up relative to international peers? And you can see like Denmark, Norway, Saudi Arabia on the bottom. At the top, you basically have Venezuela and Canada. Again, these data are not disputed, but this isn't the real story either. We put together this graph on the right from credible sources, and essentially shows you some of the diversity of the emissions intensity of different types of oil from very select places around the world. So if you look, this is Venezuela. Here's the Alberta oil sands. Here's the United Kingdom, sort of on average. Inside of Canada, here's sort of on average the Newfoundland offshore. And this is the emissions intensity of sort of the average Norwegian barrel. So people take a look at this and they say, wow, Alberta's oil sands has huge emissions intensity. Like, that is not good. But look, let's unpack that a little bit. The reality is this kind of oil here is not the same as that kind of oil right there. I'm going to be overly simplistic. But in some places of the world, you just punch a hole in the ground, oil comes out. Super simple. You just grab the oil and you ship it on its way in a pipeline, refine it, what have you. In the oil sands, by definition, the oil is actually compacted inside a sand matrix. You punch a hole in the ground, nothing happens. So usually, what you do then is you have to heat water into steam, use the steam to melt the oil away from the sand, and that's just a remarkable energy input, and it's therefore a remarkable emissions footprint. But the companies have no option. So this is a fundamentally different resource than this one here. But this sort of puts into context about different types of oil, but also puts into context the actual emissions performance relative to those different types of oil. So I'll leave it there for now, and we'll go back to our panel. Hopefully people feel that that's sort of a rational, somewhat balanced view of the world. And actually, we'll start with opening comments. So Sarah, we'll give you the honors remotely for about 3 minutes to give you sort of opening statement comments.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and glad that I can join you remotely for this time. I'll make 3 really brief points that I think we'll come back to more during the conversation. But one is really just the observation, as you've just presented, that the policies that we have today have been insufficient to drive the type of emissions reductions that we need. And I think that that's understandable from the perspective of the challenge of bringing investors along on emission reduction investments that are not about efficiency improvements, but are about deeper emission cuts from things like carbon capture and storage and others. And so I think there's a very clear track record of a need for additional types of policies, and I think we'll come to discuss that more. The other two opening points I wanted to make is, you heard already today from the panel on electrification of transportation. And I think it's important to note that while there are debates around exactly the pathway that we're going to be on when it comes to, the global picture of transportation electrification, it's very clear that we are along many metrics on a pathway that is actually compatible with net zero. The IEA has shown that, sales to date of passenger electric vehicles is one of the few areas, honestly, globally that we are actually on a net zero pathway, and that has real implications for future demand for oil, given the importance of transportation fuel within that. And the other piece that I look forward to discussing further is this question of the competitiveness of Alberta's oil in the global market and what the right comparators are. And I think that often within that discussion, we get very we tend to view it through the lens of today's mix of refineries, of demand for products from those refineries, and of the input slate that those refineries take. And so, if we fast forward to the 2030 picture and ultimately to the 2050 picture, the idea that our competitors when it comes to cost and carbon intensity from oil are somehow fixed as the heavy oil producers in the world, I think really sort of skips over the massive change that we're going to see in the refining sector, and the potential for refineries that are already needing to retool because of a need to produce a different slate of outputs, having the opportunity to also change the input mix that they are able to use to produce those outputs. And so when, sort of more general comment at a high level, I would put that as the perspective of we're talking about very massive changes in the global oil market. And so we need to be very careful about our sort of assumptions and where we're basically assuming that certain elements of that market will remain static today. And I think that has really very real implications for this question of what does a long-term future for Canada's oil, and in particular for the oil sands, look like when it comes to being competitive in that global market. So looking forward to the further conversation, and I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Remember, put your Slido questions in for the end. And Mark, do you want a couple minutes?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Mark Cameron. I work with the Pathways Alliance, which represents Canada's 6 largest oil sands producers. Collectively, we operate about 95% of Canada's oil sands production. So as Dan said, the oil and gas industry in Canada is differentiated into different sectors. The oil sands is, roughly speaking, about half of Canada's total oil and gas production on a barrel of oil equivalent basis, about 3 million barrels a day. Then there's about 1.5 million barrels a day of conventional production, and about 10 billion cubic feet, which is about 1.5 million barrels of oil equivalent for natural gas. So that's kind of, in rough terms, what the industry is like in Canada. And we represent the vast majority of that oil sands portion. The idea, clearly, and I'm glad that Dan acknowledged that there's been great progress in reducing emissions intensity. In fact, I think over the last 12 years, emissions intensity of our marketed products is now down 25%. So that, that's a significant improvement. As Dan says, a lot of that is motivated by trying to have more efficient production, but there have been some deliberate efforts to reduce emissions intensity for their own sake. But as Sarah said, we're now talking about step changes, not simply incremental improvements, but improvements that are really pursuing not simply ways of producing the same product more efficiently, but producing the product with a far lower carbon footprint. And in the short term, carbon capture and storage for the oil sands is the most important tool in the toolbox. For the conventional sector, in conventional oil and gas production, it's really methane abatement. And so those are the two areas where there's potential for significant short-term reductions. And the industry, I think as a whole, is really committed to reducing our carbon intensity. Our 6 companies have all taken commitments to net zero by 2050 for our upstream operations. There's the question of Scope 3 emissions we can get into, but that's a separate issue. But in terms of those emissions that are contributing to Canada's global emissions, we are committed to net zero by 2050. The question is, what is the most efficient and effective path to get there? We think we can reduce our emissions by about 22 megatons by 2030. That will require a lot of cooperation by federal, provincial governments, Indigenous communities, all kinds of other actors. But we think we can do that. That's not the 42% reduction that the emissions reduction plan calls for. On the conventional side, methane emissions, those can probably come down to 75% below 2012 levels. But again, you put those two things together, you're still well short of that target. So the question is not, whether we're aiming for net zero or whether there should be a cap. The question is, what is the timeline? What is the target? How fast can we go reasonably economically? And
who will pay for it?
And who will pay for it?
Yeah. That's a key thing we'll get to in a second here. Chris, 2 minutes.
Yeah. So some of the things I want to point out, like often when I come to Ottawa, I'm talking to people about the oil and gas emissions cap, and a lot of the questions that I get are things like, what. Is the Pathways Alliance, because usually the conversations are about the oil sands when we talk about the oil and gas emission cap, are they actually making progress and on their plan, or what is it going to take in order for us to get the big emission reductions that have been talked about? Is it necessary to actually implement an oil and gas emissions cap to achieve that? And I'm often surprised that how often these types of questions come up. I think it's just constantly sort of reinforcing the message that we're not actually seeing any real investment in those plans yet, and we're not going to see any investment in those plans until we have both incentives, but also a clear regulatory requirement to proceed with those investments. And this is because we're talking about really significant sums of money here, and companies are primarily being directed by their shareholders and investors to return dividends to shore up the share value of the companies. That's the strategy that they are demanding of these big companies, and that's what the companies are really focused on right now. Some have even gone so far as to point out to their shareholders, we are not looking to develop wind and solar. We are focused on our core business, which is producing oil and gas and driving down the cost of production. And so we're just simply not going to see that kind of investment until we have an oil and gas emission cap. And I bring this up because just on every single trip to Ottawa, this comes up. I think it's really important to recognize that it's absolutely critical that we have those a regulation put in place. And then, when I think of it, as an Albertan, I'm very concerned about, if we don't manage to get an oil and gas emission cap in place, what's going to happen to such a significant source of revenue for the province and for jobs for people that work in the oil and gas sector, because we are going to face a decline in demand for oil and gas, because we are seeing the rest of the world starting to take action on their climate plans, and they have every motivation to do it. And if we find ourselves in a situation where there's a significant benefit to having a lower carbon barrel of oil, and that from a competitive standpoint, it's going to be too late for us to start to implement those types of projects at that point in time.
Okay, I think you just answered my next question, but maybe I'll let the other two answer. So, it's this notion of cap. Okay, so the answer is, the question is a regulatory cap on emissions reasonable or unreasonable? But again, the context here is again, I think it was fair to say the companies have tried really hard to reduce to improve their productivity, which has an associated emissions reduction. The companies basically have reduced their emissions 1% to 2% for the whole length of the oil sands existence. That pace has not changed. But I think it's also fair to say that the number of projects or the number of investments that companies have made that detract from the bottom line, that reduce emissions, except for small exceptions, basically rounds to nothing compared to the amount of investment they have put into improving their productivity, and therefore we got emissions reduction. And I think the point is that emissions reductions decreases is fairly predictable pace, And yet the problem is production increases. So the production increases have always swamped out the emissions intensity improvements. The sector's own projections are that they'll increase production by about 500,000 barrels a day next year. So we're looking actually at a market increase in absolute emissions intensity next year using the sector's own data. So the question is a regulatory cap on emissions reasonable or unreasonable? Who wants to go first?
Well, I would reframe the question. Alberta already.
Sure you would.
Alberta
but answer the question the way you framed it.
But Alberta has an emissions cap already, right? Alberta has an oil sands emissions limit of 100 megatons for the oil sands, which was accepted by not all players, but most players in the industry actually stood up on stage and accepted.
What year was that?
Sorry?
What year was that?
2015.
Yeah. So before or after the Paris Accord came out?
It was the same year.
Before.
So, but the issue is. There is an oil sands cap. That cap is not disputed because it's a reasonable limit. In fact, we could probably lower that cap quite comfortably at this point. Can we absorb a cap of a 42% reduction from 2019 levels? No, that would require shutting in 1 million or 2 million barrels per day of production. So that's really the issue. The issue is not whether there should be a cap; it's what the cap should look like.
So the cap is, of course, made up of. You mentioned, Mark, that the industry is differentiated. So I mean, really. 22 megatons from the oil sands sector. Methane is a big source of emission, and this is one of the things that is happening, and it's happening quite quickly, and doesn't appear to be any real significant opposition to it. The US and Canada are likely to announce new regulations that align with each other. Alberta has actually proposed a target that's even more ambitious than what the federal government has proposed. So that is a significant source of emission, especially in that sort of 2030 timeframe. Another chunk comes from electrifying the upstream oil and gas industry, and and here we really need we need a lot of electricity, and we need a clean source of electricity to do that. But I think when we're talking about the oil sands, I think what's reasonable, I think, starts to come down to more like timing. Like we need to get on with these projects as soon as possible because they do take a long time to develop and to do right and to ensure that there is Indigenous communities are on board and fully supportive of these things. And so, time is ticking away. And this is where I get concerned, especially where we're sort of pushing the limit of what's sort of possible in terms of technological timing.
So I think, Mark, if I heard you right, your companies are fine with a cap. It's just, what is the cap?
Yeah, and what are the rules around it? So,
right. Yeah. Sarah, any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that what is the cap is the whole ball game, right? If you have a cap that is far above what you ever imagine emissions will reach, then it's not very meaningful. I think I come back to is it reasonable? I mean, that's somewhat of a values-based question, right?
And
but I think that there. Yeah, which I think is correct actually. But in that sort of values lens, I think that I would argue that we have not seen substantial emission reductions under the approaches that we've taken, and that the design of carbon pricing with really significant amounts of output-based allocations is clearly not driving these projects to be constructed. So I think that if we have a net zero target as a country that we really intend to meet, and part of that is being able to show progress along the way, then I think it is very reasonable to doubt what the 2040s and 2050 might bring us if we don't see progress up to 2030. Now, whether that has to be, hard cap and it has to be 2030 versus 2031, right? I think that there could be room for real discussions of, if there is serious money invested and there is steel in the ground and projects are being built out, there I tend to agree that the exact year for that is, can be flexible without perhaps losing the intention of having a cap and actually forcing these projects to be built. But at the bottom line, I think, we're hearing that CCS needs substantial support because it is an expensive and untested technology, and that's what justifies the ask for 75% of those costs to be paid by the federal government and provincial governments, I should say, governments across Canada. I think it's very reasonable to then say, well, if we don't know that it's going to work and it's going to work affordably, we need to make real progress on that up till 2030, and we need to do that through a regulatory mechanism that's going to drive investment that we're, simply not seeing to date.
Fair enough. Okay, so I think it sort of depends on what you define reasonable or unreasonable as those answers. But let's go to sort of a temporal thing. Again, so the last oil sands question, and we'll go to some methane. The oil sands companies are relying in a major way on carbon capture and storage to decarbonize. And Pathways Alliance was launched a number of years ago, but we actually have seen one engineering study. But the question is, are we running out of time to actually make the capital investments and make the system of carbon capture and storage in order for the companies to really contribute to the 2030 target and 2050? So are we getting our backs up against the wall, and do we have enough time actually to do this now, considering the progress we made in the last 3 years?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable question. I mean, Pathways has been in existence for almost 2.5 years. The work on it began before that.
2012.
COSIA started in 2012, but I mean, the actual work on the Pathways.
Oh, no, we started in 2012 working on those pathways. It's over 10 years old, the project.
The question is, if we started today, yes, we can still meet that timeline. And in fact, there's a lot of work already underway. There is 2 test wells that have been drilled in the sequestration area, 4 others that have been tested. The whole pipeline route has been surveyed. 54% of the FEED studies have been completed. So next year we'd be looking at ordering pipe. The regulatory application will be filed with the AER. So there's actually a lot of work. The Indigenous consultation has formally started in September. The application for the pore space has gone in. So work is underway. Tens of millions of dollars have been spent. In addition to a lot more money on that on many of the other projects that you'd be familiar with from COSIA and things like the coke boiler replacement that Suncor is doing. But there's a lot of work currently underway. It's a $16.5 billion capital project.
How much, sorry?
$16.5 billion. And it has to happen within 6 years. So we have to start now.
How much free cash flow did the 6 companies send back to their shareholders last year?
They sent back less money than they sent to the federal and provincial governments in royalties and revenue.
$29 billion is the answer, actually.
Yeah.
But no, yeah. So are we running out of time, Chris, or no?
I guess I'm not hearing a lot of opposition to implementing the oil and gas emissions cap, which I think is positive. We've got a Pathways Alliance who has put forward a commitment to do it, and it's the biggest source of emissions that we have in Canada. I think if we don't act on the oil and gas emission cap, we're going to very quickly and significantly lose credibility and lose our voice in the international negotiations around climate change. Why would anybody listen to a country like Canada saying what they should do about climate change if we're not prepared to address the emissions from our largest sector, especially when we're a wealthy country with lots of resources, lots of land, and that sort of thing. And so that's also at risk. I know that there's a lot of hand-wringing about the oil and gas emission cap, and again, what I mentioned off the top, questions about whether or not it's even necessary. Like the companies, they tell us on Hockey Night in Canada that the project is well underway, or at least that's the impression that I think a lot of people come away with. But it is absolutely critical that there is a regulatory framework that requires companies to go to their investors and shareholders and say, okay, the new strategy is and to make these very large-scale investments, and we need to do it as quickly as possible.
Sarah, do you have a strong opinion on that, or we go on to another question? I'm sort of feeling to give Mark hard enough ride and sort of take him out of the spotlight for a second here on methane, but up to you. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just make one observation
Sure.
on the timeline, right? And I think it's important that we put this in the broader context of how long we've been talking about this for, right? And this idea of, of course, these projects can't get built overnight. If I go back to the 2008 climate strategy, climate plan that Alberta had released that would have seen us have 50 megatons of carbon capture and storage implemented in the province by 2020, obviously, we're kind of far off from that target. But that gives you a sense of sort of how long it's been that we've been having this conversation. And I think what's behind a lot of, in my mind, this question of, reasonableness of we've sort of tried the waiting and seeing if this was going to happen. And now it is reasonable to start putting into place some targets to ensure that we are actually making concrete progress.
Okay. Let's switch gears to methane. Not everything is oil sands, even though we all knew what we're getting into on this panel. So methane is a powerful greenhouse gas and has attracted global attention for priority action. How realistic is Canadian target of 75% reduction?
So we heard Minister Guilbeault talk about how important it is as a short-term climate forcer. So it's something we could actually buy time to address climate change and maybe blunt the most harmful impacts of climate change by really taking advantage of the opportunity to reduce methane emissions. So in the upstream oil and gas sector, it remains the low-hanging fruit. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of countries. The United States is proposing to do some similar approach to regulating methane emissions. There's little opposition, including from Alberta. And if you can produce a supply of gas that is low in upstream emissions, it is a lower carbon input into other things, right? So whether it's being used in power generation or whether it's being used in petrochemicals. And I think this is something that the Alberta government, I think, actually understands.
Mark?
Yeah,
So let's see, our time is out, but go quick and we'll go to...
So 75% target is reasonable. The question is, do you have highly prescriptive regulations? You have to inspect pipes X times per month, or do you have more of a market-based system where you can simply prove that you reduce emissions and trade it among companies? But absolutely 75% is an achievable target.
Sarah?
I defer to my co-panelists on this one.
Sorry, I glitched there. I didn't hear that. You...
Oh, I was just going to defer to.
Oh, defer. Okay, I
my
didn't get that word.
co-panelists
Okay,
on
look,
that one.
folks, we have a 1 minute warning, so that we've given us a bit of an extension here. So the question that was there was the question of cost. If we go back to the concept of oil sands, is how reasonable is it to ask the taxpayer to pay for the majority of decarbonizing any oil and gas company, but Mark, especially the oil sands, given the fact that they are about the most profitable sector in the history of Confederation. So, Mark.
I mean, the investment tax credit for carbon capture and storage is not an oil sands or oil and gas tax credit. It's a carbon capture and storage tax credit. It applies to cement, it applies to steel, it applies to everyone else. There is no large-scale carbon capture projects in the world that aren't being built with something in the order of 2/3 government funding. Whether you look at Norway, UK, you look at the Quest project, which I think is the most successful example in Canada so far. That's the level of support that has been necessary for these projects to go ahead in any industry. So if Canada is going to be competitive, we have 2 of our 6 companies that are multinationals are looking at projects around the world. We have 2 other companies that own U.S. assets that are benefiting from the IRA. So if we're looking to decarbonize, that's unfortunately carbon capture. It's not unproven, untested technology, but it is expensive technology.
I would agree with that last statement.
Yeah, and I don't disagree. And again, it's a commitment like we've seen from companies, incentives, investment tax credit, and actual regulations are the only, that is the combination that is going to be necessary. At some point, it won't make sense to continue to provide investment tax credits for this because the technology will not be as novel and unproven. But for the time being, it definitely is needed.
I'll just point out, Canada is a world leader in this, and to the extent that it's proven globally, we can do it here. That's just a fact. One thing that Mark and I would agree on that. So yeah. And Sarah, wind it up here for us.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I've written extensively on the role of government supporting innovation. So there is a clear role there. I think that the issue is what that role looks like, what form that support takes, and how long it's there for. There's very clearly a role for support of innovation de-risking and proving out new technologies. We saw that in the oil sands themselves, with the government taking a key role there. At the same time, the question is, when does that support get removed when technology is proven? And the current structure of the investment tax credits, doesn't really take that into account. It doesn't take into account kind of are there better ways to manage that risk through things like carbon pricing guarantees that were discussed earlier today? Who's benefiting from that when you take it the Norway case and the very different structure of royalties for the resource there, of course, would lead to a different, perhaps fair balance of covering that cost. But I think it's fair to say that the current structure of government support for carbon capture and storage really isn't following kind of the best practices about what we know about the form that government support for new technology should take. And so I think that, in the very short run, it's unlikely to be far from the right form, but in the longer run, concerns around basically subsidizing part of the cost of production if producing oil with a zero carbon footprint is the entrance ticket to being part of that market. That's clearly not an appropriate role for government funds.
Folks, our panel's done. Hopefully it was informative and maybe a little bit entertaining, and I would say thanks to everyone for, frankly, a rational conversation. Okay, thanks. Yeah.